So the next session, as I mentioned, is on research and innovation in impact assessment. And our first speakers, I won't go through the bio, I'll let them do their own intro, but Michael Grassi is the Manager of Science and Research at the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, and Jenna Woolnough is the Operational Policy Officer at Impact Assessment Agency of Canada.
Right, and we will try to be as brief as possible because we know we're the last thing between you and lunch. And yeah, so the last question, I think, in the previous session touched on this, but before we dive in, we just wanted to note that we're mindful folks are very curious to learn more about the October 13th Supreme Court of Canada opinion on the Impact Assessment Act. So we just wanted to note that, as noted in the Minister's response on that same day, the opinion provides clarity and direction to develop amendments to the IA legislation and ensure that it meets Canadians' needs and values, as well as Canada's unique constitutional requirements, and that we're carefully and expeditiously reviewing the court's opinion to understand its implications for the federal IA process. And we're of course very mindful of the need to ensure certainty and continuity in the process, and we'll be communicating more details on our approach in the days ahead. So just wanted to start with that briefly. So I'll just introduce myself. I'm Michael Grassi. I manage the research program at the agency. I'm a settler. I'm thankful to live in Ottawa on the territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. And I'm here with my colleague Jenna Woolnough, who works in our team, and very thankful for the opportunity to come to OAIA and speak with you about the agency's research program. So I'm going to turn it over to Jenna to get started with some context on the program, and then we're going to provide some examples of projects that have been funded, as well as do a bit of an interactive Q&A using Menti. So yeah, with that, I'll turn it over to Jenna to get started.
Thank you, Michael. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jenna Woolnough. As mentioned, I'm an Operational Policy Officer with the Impact Assessment Agency's research program, and I will be joining Michael in our presentation today on research and innovation in impact assessment. So 3 main objectives for today's presentation. First and foremost, as we will be centered on the agency's research program, I do want to spend just a few minutes going over sort of the nuts and bolts of the program itself, what it's all about, how it functions, and how you could potentially get involved. Second, we want to take the opportunity today to share some of the excellent research that has been funded under the program over the past several years, really just to give you a sense of the different types of tools, resources, trains of thoughts that is out there right now in the world of impact assessment, if you aren't already able to access that. And thirdly, as Michael mentioned, we are going to do what is hopefully a fun interactive workshop using Menti, just to get a sense and tap into your shared expertise and knowledge in the field of impact assessment. Where are you seeing gaps in the field of IA, and how could research potentially fill those gaps moving forward? So starting in on the research program itself, just a brief overview here. The program has been around for several years, dating back to previous legislation, but it has made a few changes over the past several years, specifically to allow for a more multidisciplinary approach to the types of research projects that we are funding. The program itself has 3 main objectives. You'll see those on the slide here. You might also notice that the objectives are quite broad, and that is purposely done in order to allow for a really inclusive and wide selection of not only the projects that the research program is providing funding for, but also the types of recipients that we are able to provide funding for as well. So just to touch on those objectives of the program, number 1, the name of the game is impact assessment research. So of course, one of the objectives is to create and support research for high quality impact assessment. And with this, we are talking at both the project, regional, as well as strategic levels. Number 2, to expand the impact assessment research community. And by expansion, we sort of mean this on a number of different levels. Expansive geographically speaking, we do fund projects coast to coast across the country. As I mentioned earlier, expansion across multiple disciplines. As everyone in this room, I'm sure, can attest, impact assessment is a very multidisciplinary field, ranging from physical to social sciences. So we do try and push the boundaries in terms of the types of projects we are able to fund, as well as we aim to promote research funding for equity-deserving groups. And third objective of the research program is to share information with all groups that can benefit from the research. So this is an objective that is near and dear to Michael and my heart. It's essentially a real emphasis on knowledge translation and mobilization and making sure that research that's funded under the program is not simply sitting on a shelf, but is available for you to use and access and hopefully support you in your roles within the IA field. One of the ways that the agency does this so far is we do make all the research funded under the program available on our research program website in both official languages. And I'll touch a little bit more on some other research dissemination strategies in just a minute. Oh, yeah, I've got this. Okay, so hopefully by now you are asking yourself, wow, this sounds really great. How can I get involved? So let me go through some of those details with you. With that being said, Michael and I are here for the conference, so if you have any specific questions about your eligibility or you would like to discuss a specific research project idea, please feel free to flag either of us down over the lunch break. We also have a generic inbox that we have listed on the slide if you'd like to set up a meeting. So in terms of the who is eligible, the program is able to fund Indigenous communities and organizations, academic and research institutions, as well as not-for-profits and charities, and individuals that sort of compromise any of these groups. In terms of the what, the types of activities that are eligible for funding, again, you will notice a very, very broad list here, which is purposely done so that we can cast a wide net of the types of research projects for funding. So projects related to impact assessment tools, frameworks, methodologies, projects that are focused from a more scientific lens or an Indigenous knowledge or a two-eyed seeing lens, and networks as well that you can use. We also fund networks on top of more of a traditional research project. So I mentioned that research dissemination is something very important to us here at the agency's research program, and it is also something that we are working to continuously improve our practices on. So we'll spend just a couple minutes here going through what our current practices are, but just as a flag for our Menti questions later on today, we are going to be touching base with you to see how you would like to engage and interact with the research that's coming out of our program. So we do our best to have internal and external dissemination strategies. Internally, we make sure that all staff are able to either participate in or benefit from research that's coming from the program. We can do this through either having staff involved in the research process itself, or we can communicate the results of research studies. So we have a number of different mechanisms internally. So we have a regular webinar series where we invite researchers to come speak about their research. We have research newsletters, targeted workshops, as well as future plans for a panelist Q&A. And then externally, as I mentioned, we do post all of the research on our website in both official languages, and then we aim to promote these on social media. But again, this is a question I'll touch base on a little bit later. What else would you like to see us be doing for this that would support you in your world and your work in the IA sphere? So with that, I will now turn things over to Michael. He's going to walk us through some of the innovative research projects and partnerships that have come through the program's doors over the past couple of years.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Jenna. So yeah, as Jenna mentioned, I'm just going to flag a couple of recent examples, and this is really only a snapshot of what we've been able to fund over the past few years and moving forward, and encourage folks to check out our full complement of available resources on our research program website. And so the first example we have for you, we were pleased to fund a study recently by the Women in Resource Development Corporation, or WRDC, on diversity, equity, and inclusion best practices for major projects in the Newfoundland and offshore oil industry. So WRDC identified a number of past diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives used within the industry, and used key informant interviews to come up with a list of recommendations on best practices or types of initiatives that proponents in the agency can put into action. So a couple of highlights from the recommendations put forward from the study were that legislation and regulation, monitoring and reporting are critical. Diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are most successful when companies have a dedicated resource or champion who reports directly to senior management. And collaboration between and within regulators, operators, contractors, industry associations, education institutions, and community groups is also key. So as Jenna mentioned, that report can be found on our website for everyone to access. The second example we have is a project completed by the Asia Pacific Foundation for Climate and Health that's led by Dr. Jenna Chandro, who some of you may be familiar with from her work kind of in the health impact assessment sphere specifically. So this project was based on a need to fund additional research into the ever-changing and complex web of health, social, and economic effects. So specifically, this project looked at developing a synthesis of existing resources, drawing from international standards related to mitigation and enhancement measures for HSE effects, with the intent of providing targeted resources for IA practitioners in Canada. So they were able to produce a research report and infographic, which are both available online, that can walk practitioners through leading standards and resources that have been found to directly guide and inform successful HSE mitigation and enhancement measures for projects both in Canada and around the globe. So our next example, I figured out the clicker this time. So another project we wanted to highlight, and I believe both Justina and Anna are in attendance, but we were pleased to fund a project last year focused on the treatment of biodiversity under the Impact Assessment Act. And this one was an interesting one as well, because it was a collaborative effort between Anna and Justina leading on the research and our Technical Advisory Committee on Science and Knowledge, or the TAC as we call it. So the TAC has a subcommittee where they've identified treatment of biodiversity under the IAA as a priority. So they were very keen to tab Anna and Justina to conduct a research study last year to inform the subcommittee's advice to the agency. So I won't, Anna and Justina will speak to this much more eloquently than me, but at a high level, the study was focused on assessing the treatment of biodiversity under the IAA with consideration of relevant environmental obligations and decision making, with the objective to identify gaps and challenges, key principles for the treatment of biodiversity under the IAA, and identify areas for future research or policy development. And the next project we wanted to briefly touch on is a project led out of the Westwood Lab at Dalhousie University. So we worked with Dr. Alana Westwood and Ali McKellar on a project that focused on looking at the impacts of major projects on marginalized and 2S LGBTQ2+ communities. So the study was informed by the IA requirements to consider gender-based analysis plus in all assessments and understand project effects on diverse groups, looking at understanding the experiences, historical and present, of marginalized populations when they interact with major resource development projects. And their recommendations were focused around 6 key themes: rebuilding relationships, meaningful and accessible community consultations, conducting community-driven research, ensuring accountability, and updating procedural and administrative practices, as well as developing supplemental tools and resources. And one particular highlight of this project was a interdisciplinary workshop in Ottawa that the Westwood Lab hosted in May, where sort of key knowledge holders were brought together for a 2-day session to feed into the ultimate report that was provided at the completion of the project. So we're just going to highlight one other upcoming project. So we're very pleased to be able to partner with Alex Bridges and Keepers of the Circle. So this is a project that is going to focus on better understanding the relationship between resource development projects, IAs, and violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ2+ peoples. And the goal of the research is to develop a set of standard mitigation measures that can be used to better address project risk to that set of the population. This work is in the early stages, but we'll be pleased to disseminate results as we work through the project with Alex further, and it's directly in response to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls to action, and it builds on previous work that we funded by Narratives Inc. Last fiscal year, which also aimed to directly respond to calls for action, and we're currently working on having that report published on the website, but it has been shared out there on social media by Narratives as well. And then a couple of other examples. So Jenna mentioned one of the streams of initiatives that we can fund our research networks. So we have Dr. Ian Stewart here from King's University. So Ian and his colleague Deborah Davidson with the University of Alberta engaged with us, close to coming into force, Ian, and proposed setting up a network focused on bringing together social science experts in the field of IA. So I don't know if Ian, you'll touch on this in your presentation tomorrow, so I won't get too much into it, but some of the initiatives supported through the network include lots of webinars. There's a series of case studies that Ian and team are working on, and Ian also hosted a successful workshop this summer that brought together sort of key minds in Ottawa. And I've got one more network example here as well. So this is a new initiative that we're excited to announce that's just going to begin this fall. So this will be a network on GBA Plus in impact assessment, and we're partnering with the University of Guelph as well as the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women. And the goal of this new initiative will be to develop and maintain a interdisciplinary research and practice-based network that can facilitate GBA Plus and Indigenous-led capacity building for proponents, the agency, other government departments, and NGOs. And objectives include, promoting knowledge sharing, developing additional tools and resources, creating a new database of research, and fostering interjurisdictional learning between researchers and practitioners. And if anyone is interested in, participating in the network, the folks running the network are actually very keen to identify and accept new members. So if you have any potential interest in that or any questions, as Jenna mentioned, we're here for the conference and happy to connect with you on that. So with that, we can get into the more interesting portion of the show, and Jenna's going to walk us through a virtual Q&A session on Menti. So I don't know if folks have used Menti before. It's similar to Slido, and it's kind of a live Q&A polling tool. So you can go on your smartphone or laptop to menti.com and enter the code that Jenna has shown on the screen. And we're just going to run through quickly a series of a few questions.
Okay, thanks, Michael. So I'm going to give everyone a couple of minutes there just to get set up. You can go on your phones or laptops just to menti.com, and then you're going to be entering that 8-digit code in. I see a number of thumbs up that are coming in already, which is great. So I'm going to give it another 15 or more seconds, and very specific, Ian, I know. I recognize that the time is noon, so I do not think that we will have the opportunity to get through all of our questions today, but what I would like to do is just introduce the survey to you. We'll go through one of the maybe priority questions, and then what I will do is, following the end of the conference today, is I will go ahead and open up the Menti portal for you to go in at your own pace. We'll leave it open for the rest of the week, and feel free to dive on in. So I think we've got enough people in here that we can get started with our first question.
Okay, I got it.
Okay. So tapping into some of the shared expertise within this room, and I should also mention that the purpose of us doing this survey here today is really to help inform future research priorities that the program will look towards for the years to come for funding. So we really want to make sure that we're tuned in with where are the gaps, where are the issues that IA practitioners and researchers are seeing in their practice. So I see that we already have folks answering the first question, which is great. So what are some examples of key gaps in impact assessment practice that could be addressed by further research? What are your burning questions? What would you like clarity on? What resources would you find really useful in your line of work? So we'll let the answers roll on in for a tiny bit here. I'm hoping you can see the word cloud as it appears. I'm not sure if it's large enough. Cumulative effects is, of course, turning out to be a really large one. And then not surprisingly, sort of after cumulative effects, it looks like Indigenous rights and Indigenous engagement, meaningful engagement are of course priority topics. This is really helpful for us to know. Psychological impacts. There's a lot of shared expertise here. This is going to be a very fun list to digest later on this week. Appreciate your input. So I think with that, I might move on to the next question for now. I think what we're seeing here is a really big focus on cumulative effects, climate change, Indigenous rights, GBA+, sort of the hot button topics that everyone's talking about at the moment. So we'll move on over to our next question here. So a logical next stepping stone, we've identified some of the gaps. What are some of the specific research project ideas that you would like to see funded by the agency's research program in the future? This can be, a specific idea. This could be a theme. This could be, a network that you'd like to see. What would be useful for you to interact with in terms of IA research? And while this is going, I wonder if anyone would like to share or elaborate on their response. We maybe just have time for one person, either on this question, what types of research you'd like to see, or on the previous question, where are some of the burning gaps that you are seeing in impact assessment practice? Or it might just be that time of day where everyone's hungry for lunch, so that is okay. We are going to continue on with the Mentimeter. I see that we have a number of answers coming through. So what I will do now actually is, as our final sort of question for the day here, if you click on the next button, you should actually be able, are you able to see a voting platform where you can respond to people's answers? No, okay, we're moving on to the next question. This will be our final one here. What types of research projects would be most useful to you? So as we mentioned, we do fund projects that typically have sort of a research style report. We have case studies, methodologies, frameworks, workshops, presentations. In your line of work, what is the most useful way for research to come to you? Case studies and tools are coming up as our most notable responses so far. Okay, case studies, tools, workshops, reports, frameworks. Essentially, we will just continue to run the gambit in terms of what the research program is able to offer. But with that being said, I know we do have a couple of questions left, but we are running short on time here. So as I mentioned, we will open up this portal for you to go in if you have any thoughts that pop into your head later this evening or later on in the week. We'd really appreciate your input here and your shared expertise. So with that, I will thank you very much for your participation and for your attention during our session today, and wish you all a happy lunch.
All right, thanks everyone. We're going to get started. Hopefully everybody got enough lunch and caffeine and ready to go. So we've got 3 more sessions here with respect to our second set of presentations on innovation. And our next our speaker right after lunch here is Laura Bowman, who's a lawyer with Eco-Justice Canada in Toronto. And Laura's going to present a case study in highway exemptions. Do they meet the goals of IA? So just as a reminder as well, we've got 2 more presentations after this, and then we'll do a Q&A session. So hold your questions until that time. So please welcome Laura.
Thank you. So the goal of this presentation is to really get people thinking a little bit about regulatory streamlining and modernization. Does it actually meet the goals of environmental assessment and impact assessment? And what are the actual consequences of streamlining in the context of highways? And I'm really just using highways as a case study. So I'm a lawyer with Eco-Justice. We're a national environmental law charity with offices across the country. And in my legal work, I've recently been involved with the GTA West and Bradford Bypass, but I've been involved with a number of other highways over the years as well. So I want to kind of take us back to first principles before I get into the case study, and that's that impact assessment was not originally envisioned as simply a process to identify mitigation measures. But I'm very aware that the kind of culture around EA, in Ontario in particular, is that that's what EA is for. But when EA was first created as a process in the 1970s, the goal was to fundamentally transform how we do things and when we do things to ensure that those things are sustainable and that decisions at the beginning of a process are sustainable. And it was, when NEPA was enacted in the United States, it was supposed to be an environmental bill of rights. It was supposed to be transformative. But over time, EA has become more of an empty procedure, and one that is very focused on mitigating the effects of a project and not on actually deciding whether or not to do the project. And it's become very disconnected from that initial goal of a transformative environmental outcome. So in Ontario, we've had a number of, I would say, quite contentious highway proposals over the last, say, 20 years. Many of these have been quite controversial, and the EAs for them have been quite controversial. And so I want to just take us through, well, what happened with some of these? And did the exemptions that were used to try and fast-track these projects actually help them or hurt them? So the main example I'm going to talk about is the Red Hill Creek Expressway. This is a very dated example, but it went through a very, very convoluted process, which I think you'll see, for those of you who are familiar with the current highway proposals, you'll see many, many echoes of the current problems that we're facing with highway proposals and this one. So this is a highway in Hamilton, went through the Niagara Escarpment, and it was initially rejected by a board of control in the 1950s. It then was put back in Hamilton's transportation plan in the 1960s. In the 1970s, an EA designation was actually requested by the proponent. But then in the 1980s, it was exempted. At that time, EAs went through a joint board process, and there was a joint board that gave a conditional approval in 1985, but it was conditional on not opening through the escarpment. And that process was approved by Cabinet in 1987, and there was an unsuccessful challenge to the divisional court in 1990s. In the 1990s, after the proponent was successful at divisional court, there was a saw turning ceremony, which was followed by the funding all being removed. Then there were more cabinet approvals in the late 90s. The project was then amended to include going through the escarpment. After that, DFO identified SIA triggers, and in the late 1990s, the Ministry of Environment exempted the project from EA, again, with conditions. But then there was a review panel referral under SIA 1995, and that was litigated in federal court. Federal court found that SIA didn't apply to the expressway. Then there were protests with people sitting in the trees that some of you might remember. There's now allegations that Hamilton Council, hid friction tests that showed the highway was slippery, and it's the subject of a public inquiry. Now, I want you to ask yourself, did the exemptions help us get to a good project here? Did it help us get to a fast project here? Or did the exemptions, in fact, create controversy, create litigation, create protests that slowed the project down and made it more complicated? And what I'm going to suggest is that sometimes these regulatory streamlining proposals have a lot more negative impacts on the project's both success overall and timeline than you might anticipate. So, similar kind of story with the Bradford bypass. Various proposals in the 1970s and 80s. It got exempted from the Ontario Environmental Assessment Board process that existed at the time, which created controversy about the project. When the EA was completed, it took 5 years for MECP to approve it, approved it with a large number of outstanding conditions because of the incompleteness of that process. Because those conditions were difficult to complete, in the meantime, the project was shelved. Then in 2018, of course, the Ford government put it back on the table, and now there's an exemption. There were 2 different requests for a federal impact assessment designation, both denied, and one was found unreasonable by the federal court. And now, of course, we've got the Supreme Court of Canada decision on the Impact Assessment Act in the mix too. Does this seem like a successful project process? Numerous exemptions, numerous attempts to fast-track the project and skip over effects that were controversial. Once again, we have actually what is a very slow process leading to a potentially unsuccessful project. We've got the GTA West Highway, Highway 413. The EA has been going on for a number of years at this point. There were some of the initial EA reports released in around 2012 to 2014, and then the whole project was reconsidered in an advisory panel process requested by the minister, and the need for the project was questioned. In 2020, the route the route was proposed in a more refined way, but then there was an exemption proposal that's just been sitting there for a couple of years now. Whoops, lost the screen. Because there were controversial impacts that wouldn't be addressed if that exemption went ahead, there were Impact Assessment Act designation requests. I wrote it. It was designated under the Impact Assessment Act, and the proponent has now been trying to negotiate with the Impact Assessment Agency, as far as I understand, to try and get through the screening process. And now we have a Supreme Court of Canada decision that will likely change all of this, and yesterday Ontario filed a notice of application for judicial review dealing with that Impact Assessment Act designation. Once again, a convoluted process, a lengthy process, where the exemption actually triggered more controversy and other steps taken by opponents to the project, including me and my clients. And so, I've noticed this pattern. I find this pattern frustrating because all of this time and energy that goes into trying to avoid dealing with the controversial impacts of the project could just go into dealing with them and having them addressed and putting those impacts and the impacts on First Nations treaty rights in front of First Nations, dealing with whether or not the project makes sense with the public. But instead, what we do is we try and fast track the project, we try and skip the process, and we fight about it. So, I think what the lesson we can learn from this is that it probably makes more sense to invest time and effort in actually dealing with project effects rather than trying to streamline the process. We're going to continue to see jurisdictional issues arise in EAs, notwithstanding the Supreme Court of Canada's decision, and in fact, that decision may actually create more complications and more litigation around federal impact assessment designations. And as we saw with the Red Hill Creek Expressway, there can be consequences to EA process that doesn't address all of the issues, and there's an attempt to fast track it. I think as with many other projects, there's a temptation to, do a big colorful announcement. We're doing this highway and we're gonna get it done real fast. But at the end of the day, to have an effective EA process, you do need to incorporate that step of looking at need and alternatives. And that's what is part of what bogged down the GTA West project, was controversy over that. It's definitely been an issue in many of the other highway projects. And that then feeds into the controversy around the project ultimately. So we need to get past this culture of thinking about EA as just a process to deal with identifying mitigation measures, particularly, I would say, in the context of Indigenous consultation. Because when you skip over that need and alternative step, what you're doing is you're constraining the accommodations that can be provided to First Nations. You're creating the impression that your project does not stand on firm footing, right? So as an environmental lawyer that works with environmental groups, that works with community groups, the message you're sending with that is we can actually explain why we're building this. We haven't bothered to think that part of our project through. The minister told us to build it, and we're building it. And that is what is creating the controversy around your project, and it is fast-tracking the project ahead of transparent evidence to justify the project and its conditions. And how am I for time? 5 minutes? Okay. So, what are the things that are getting missed in these highway EAs? Well, induced demand, the climate impacts of the highway proposals are not being fully integrated into these assessments. We know that vehicle emissions are one of the larger sources of GHG emissions in Ontario, and also one of the fastest growing sources. But our provincial EAs are not addressing this issue. There are air quality impacts from these projects that, if you're getting this aspect of the project wrong, we've seen the impacts. This is a Toronto Public Health map of what the air quality impacts of major highways are. And there's a real cost. There's a cost in people's lives if you get these kind of impacts wrong, or you don't do a health impact assessment of a highway. And this is from the Ontario Auditor General's report. And you know, these are the kinds of things that we're skipping over when we don't do a fulsome EA process. And so yeah, that's all I have on this, but I do think that it is important to think through at the outset of your project, what message am I sending when I am skipping over controversial effects? And how is that actually going to impact people's reaction to my project? And these case studies can show how that can make things actually more complicated for you and your clients.
Thank you, Laura. Certainly some questions coming out of that presentation for sure. Appreciate the content. So now I'm going to call on Justina and Anna Johnson for their session on principles and guidance for assessing and safeguarding biodiversity through project assessment under the Impact Assessment Act.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anna Johnston. I am a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law, based in Ottawa, traditional territory, unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I also am a co-chair of the Environmental Planning and Assessment Caucus of the Canadian Environmental Network, and I sit on the Minister's Advisory Council on Impact Assessment. So I am here presenting on a project that I did with my colleague, Justina Ray, with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, on how to assess biodiversity in impact assessment, particularly under the Impact Assessment Act, but our findings are applicable under other statutes. So I'm going to begin with a bit of the context, both the international and domestic legal and policy context, first starting off with the biodiversity context, and then I'll explain the scope and methods of the project, talk about our key findings, especially gaps and challenges typically experienced in assessing biodiversity, and then our conclusions and recommendations, in particular for how impact assessment, but then also regional assessment can help deliver on our biodiversity obligations. So biodiversity is in a crisis, right? Here in Canada, as with many parts of the globe, species are in a free fall. Habitats like old growth forests and wetlands and prairie grasslands are losing ground every year. Key threats, of course, are things like habitat loss, fragmentation, overexploitation, invasive species, pollution, climate change, and the dreaded cumulative effects. So we know that in order to have a healthier relationship with nature, to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, we need to bend the curve now and become nature positive by 2030. A key question, of course, is how to do that at a project by project level in impact assessment. Also, for context, what do we mean when we say biodiversity? Well, typically people think of things like species at risk. Biodiversity is much broader than species at risk. The Convention on Biological Diversity defines it as the variability among organisms, within species, between species, and between ecosystems. So it also includes things like genetic diversity, ecosystem diversity, and things like cultural keystone species. The international context, there are a number of multilateral and bilateral instruments devoted to or pertaining to biodiversity. Of course, the most well-known one is the Convention on Biological Diversity, but then there are also things like the Ramsar Convention and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Migratory Birds Treaty, and the Sustainable Development Goals. There are a number of those that also pertain to biodiversity, like poverty, hunger, health and well-being, gender equality, climate, life above land and underwater. In the domestic, and then of course the critical one that I just about forgot to mention was about this time last year, all of the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity gathered in Montreal and agreed to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which sets out 4 overarching goals and 24 targets related to biodiversity. So a number of those are directly relevant to impact assessment, things like restoration, halting extinction rates, conservation of lands, benefits sharing. And then in the domestic context, the Impact Assessment Act, I would really wish I could just talk about the Supreme Court decision, but find me at the break. The Impact Assessment Act requires the consideration of the extent to which projects help or hinder Canada's ability to meet its environmental obligations. So it doesn't actually explicitly mention biodiversity, but it does mention environmental obligations, which we know include many pertaining to biodiversity, as well as climate commitments. There are other factors to consider, which the Supreme Court did say. It upheld all of those Section 22 factors to consider in the assessment, so we still get to take a look at them. So things like sustainability obviously pertain to biodiversity, environmental effects, biodiversity effects or environmental effects, Indigenous rights, and then gender-based analysis, plus all of these things are relevant to biodiversity. We don't have a lot of experience assessing biodiversity in Canada. SIA and SIA 2012 didn't mention biodiversity, and it was only assessed under those laws a handful of times, at least in the comprehensive study reports that the agency quite helpfully went through for us. And in provincial environmental assessments, at least in the legislation across the country, biodiversity is really inconsistently mentioned, not often mentioned, and it usually tends to show up fairly weakly. Here in Ontario, the legislation actually does mention biodiversity, or at least plant and animal life, but does not, of course, require cumulative effects assessment. So at least under the Impact Assessment Act, this requirement to consider the extent to which projects help or hinder our obligations around biodiversity can help fill an important gap, at least insofar as the Impact Assessment Act applies, especially after the Supreme Court. So we were approached, Michael mentioned this in his presentation this morning. Justina and I were approached by the Technical Advisory Committee to the agency, and then the agency quite kindly funded the project. We began by doing a literature review on the global and domestic treatment of biodiversity in environmental assessments. As I mentioned, we looked through, the agency helped us go through all available federal assessment reports from the last decade or so. We reviewed provincial laws. We looked also at what not just the international instruments are that are relevant to biodiversity, but we went through all of those and identified the specific provisions within them that are relevant to biodiversity, which is important because to date, at least, the agency hasn't been doing that in the tailored impact statement guidelines that it issues to proponents. It only mentions the overarching, like the Convention on Biological Diversity. So we wanted to get more granular and figure out what are the exact requirements or obligations under these international instruments that are relevant. And then we looked at global good practice. So combed through the literature, talked to experts, looked at things like Convention on Biological Diversity guidance, the AquaCon voluntary guidelines on engaging Indigenous peoples. And we identified a number of gaps and challenges, many of which probably won't be particularly surprising. So one is the provincial assessment regimes are inconsistent and often not very strong. At the federal level, the federal policy landscape is quite fragmented. So, we have the Impact Assessment Act, we have the Species at Risk Act, we have the Oceans Act, but they're fragmented. There's no kind of one comprehensive way of dealing with biodiversity federally. There's a lack of a standard definition. As I said, it typically tends to be considered just as species at risk. Lack of standard methodology and guidance. People don't know how to assess biodiversity. It's much more complex than assessing climate change, where you're basically just counting greenhouse gas emissions, at least on the mitigation side of things. Lack of baseline data. And then lack of substantive objectives. What do we mean when we say halt and reverse, right? What do we mean when we say restoration? Challenges, of course, key to those is cumulative effects as a key driver of biodiversity loss, and we still don't know how to do cumulative effects well, and certainly not at the project level. As I mentioned, it's much more complex than climate change. It lacks simple and standardized measurements or even proxies like a climate target. We don't have those kinds of things for biodiversity. We have the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Targets, but we need to get a lot more granular than that if we're going to do a meaningful job of addressing biodiversity at the project level. Also, it is really intersectional, pertaining to things like Indigenous rights, to sustainability. Of course, timelines, right? To do a good job, we need to take the time to do it. And we increasingly have legislated timelines that are not just making assessments shorter, but, under the Impact Assessment Act, there's a lot of rigidity, right? A lack of discretion on the ability of the agency to extend it or pause the clock when needed. Problems around alternatives assessment, so I'll get to this when I talk about our recommendations, but the mitigation hierarchy is a critical tool for assessing biodiversity, and key to the mitigation hierarchy is the meaningful identification and comparative evaluation of alternatives. We still don't do a very good job of that here in Canada, and there's a tendency to go straight to offsetting. And then, of course, on Indigenous rights, right? We don't have also a great track record in Canada of upholding Indigenous rights and authority and making sure that free, prior, and informed consent is being obtained. So, what do we do about it? We identified a number of recommendations. This is like just a handful of them. We set out a number more in our report. The first is, of course, adopt the CBD definition of biodiversity. So let's not look just at species at risk and look at things like genetic biodiversity and cultural keystone species. The second one is critical. We have to begin early because alternatives assessment is so important to biodiversity assessment and to things like finding the option that has the least amount of harm. You have to do that really early on when all of the alternatives are still on the table. Relatedly, we recommend using working groups whenever possible, always. It should always be possible because having dialogues among, Indigenous partners, the proponent, community groups, government experts, knowledge holders, independent experts really enable that comparative evaluation of alternatives and the identification of key things to focus on in assessments. We recommend be objectives oriented. So, for example, identifying what the precise international domestic policy-based targets are and any sub-targets or indicators under those. So the mitigation hierarchy, if you're not familiar with it, requires the identification first of ways to avoid impacts on biodiversity and then reduce impacts on biodiversity and finally then to offset impacts on biodiversity. The mitigation hierarchy is somewhat baked into the Species at Risk Act. It's not under the Impact Assessment Act, and it hasn't been applied very well in any of the literature that we identified around the world. There are lots of problems with it, and so we need a more rigorous application of it. ECCC, Environment and Climate Change Canada, has just come out or is just about to come out with an offsets policy that mentions the mitigation hierarchy, but it doesn't specifically prioritize the mitigation hierarchy, and so they've committed to working on a mitigation hierarchy policy that we're hoping will help. When you get to offsetting, we need to make sure that net gain is the objective and not no net loss, because there are problems with offsetting. It's not always successful, and so setting the bar higher helps, deal with the unexpected. Better spatial and temporal boundaries, that shouldn't be new to this crowd. And then incorporating biodiversity considerations, not just into the consideration of the extent to which projects are helping or hindering our ability to meet our biodiversity obligations, but also into things like sustainability, GBA+, Indigenous rights, health and cultural impact assessment. Okay, so this is the thing that people always ask me, and I normally hate it, but I have done it for you and you only. I'm gonna skip that slide because I just set myself up. Okay, so I gave you a bunch of recommendations, and then the thing that people always ask us to do is give us the doable ones, right? Give us the top 3. So I'm actually gonna do it this time. The 3 are early, right? Beginning early is critical to doing a good job on biodiversity. The second is working groups. These through the dialogue-based approaches, I think you get at things like better spatial and temporal boundaries. You get at things like what are the actual biodiversity issues that we should be most focusing on. And we get at things like what alternatives should be on the table and how are we comparing them. So those, and then really doing a good job with the mitigation hierarchy. And then I'll just back up to this. So the project was really about looking at how to do biodiversity at the project level, but of course we need to do a better job at the regional and strategic levels, because that's when we're going to do things like a better job of cumulative effects and fill in the baseline data gaps and identifying ideally ecological limits or thresholds, and developing things like collaboration agreements with Indigenous peoples that will allow us to do a better job of rights-based approaches to decision-making and assessment, and then better tiering of those with project-level assessment. So I think I'm about it. This is where I get to talk about the Supreme Court case. I'm not going to actually talk about the Supreme Court case to the relief of the agency. I am just going to say that I think it's a pretty big question mark in many of our minds, and so my opinion is that at least in the assessment stage, the Supreme Court did say that you can, the feds, there are no jurisdictional issues with assessing whatever you want to assess. It's when it gets to decision making that it gets a bit crunchier, but yeah, so I'm doing a webinar next Monday on the Supreme Court decision and what it means for impact assessment, so this is a little shameless self-promotion here if anybody's interested in attending. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Appreciate that. If I could call on our next speakers to come up, and I'll get your presentation set up. So our next presentation is on Natural Resources Canada, and it's with Christina. And Christina is presenting on behalf of her colleagues Allison and Brian, who aren't here today. Perfect.
Thank you. Yes, unfortunately, Brian and Allison couldn't be here today, and so I'm going to do my best to represent them. I'm hoping to tell you a story that started just before I went on mat leave in 2021. It seemed like a really simple idea. We want to select a few terrestrial areas to guide where to conduct cumulative effects research to best inform future regional assessments and impact assessments. Like any good story, there's many hurdles, and we explored a lot of dead ends, but I think we're on the right path now, and I'm hoping that we're getting closer to the finish. When we did this abstract, we were trying to land on like a title that would be sort of inclusive so that everyone would understand it. But then as we started to develop this deck, we realized that it was really about this journey that we've taken on trying to advance cumulative effects research at Natural Resources Canada and sort of the challenges and opportunities that we've sort of faced. So today, I'm going to take us through that journey. I'm going to start off with some background, and then I'll start delving into the multiple iterations of this project and kind of where we're at right now. So I am starting off with a definition of cumulative effects. This is a really well-informed crowd, but there are multiple definitions of cumulative effects in different legislations and different departments that they use. So there is a Government of Canada's interim message on cumulative effects, and on their webpage, it indicates that cumulative effects generally refers to the combined effects from past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future activities and natural processes. As I mentioned, the definition varies between different legislations and policies. So some definitions only consider environmental effects, where others consider the socioeconomic effects as well. Some definitions focus on human activities, where others include natural processes. And some only focus on adverse effects, where some include both of those, like positive and adverse. So as you can see from this Government of Canada interim message, we have both adverse and positive. We have both human activities and natural processes. So I wanted to review that with you guys before we jump into the rest. So Natural Resources Canada is a science-based department. We have a mandate to improve the quality of life of Canadians by ensuring that the country's abundant natural resources are developed sustainably, competitively, and inclusively. with expertise related to geoscience, forestry, geomatics, and interdisciplinary science. We focus on many aspects of cumulative effects of natural resource development. We actually even recently published a story map that goes over some of our research projects over the past 5 years. And it really showcases sort of the diversity of our cumulative effects research program and also the diverse locations in Canada where our researchers are focusing. To understand the complexity of cumulative effects, a wide range of scientific research, technical advice, and generation of knowledge on physical, biological, and anthropogenic components are needed as the foundation to provide baseline information, develop future scenario modeling, and support decision-making and future monitoring. So NRCan's broad scientific research portfolio could provide a more fulsome foundation for more comprehensive knowledge generation to support regional assessment and impact assessments. Within the impact assessment process and federal decision-making, cumulative effects is a key consideration. Recognizing that there's a need for research to understand and manage cumulative effects, federal departments, including Natural Resources Canada, received funding with the introduction of the Impact Assessment Act in Budget 2018, and again in 2023 to conduct cumulative effects research in support of regional and project level impact assessments. Now, the determination of the geographic areas to focus cumulative effects research was expected to be guided by regional assessment conducted by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. But to date, there's only been one called in the Ring of Fire, and it's still in the planning stages. So therefore, regional assessment hasn't guided the selection of areas for NRCan's research program. And so that's really at the crux of why we started this project or this initiative, was to help researchers determine where to conduct cumulative effects research. It wasn't to identify areas for future regional assessment or project level assessments, but more to really guide our scope of our research and how we could maybe help better support informed decision making. So also one of the key issues too around cumulative effects and natural resource projects is cumulative effects considerations in the impact assessment process. So when we think about this, the current approach to managing natural resources typically focuses on a single point or a single project at a single point in time. So within project level impact assessments, proponents are required to examine cumulative effects of their projects. However, this approach may be insufficient for assessing long-term impacts, as the scope is too narrow, the scale is often too small, and nearby past, current, and potential future projects are often not fully considered. Although challenging to understand and manage, cumulative effects are the result of activities and natural processes that occur at different spatial and temporal scales, including past activities and pressures that potentially occur in different areas that are manifesting in the larger landscape. Example of this growing need to better manage cumulative effects stems from the recent Yahi versus British Columbia decision. So I have an image here of the Blueberry River First Nation that compares industrial development between 1965 and 2015. And in the 2021, the BC Supreme Court ruling established that cumulative effects of industrial development meaningfully diminish Blueberry River First Nations' exercise of its treaty rights. So this decision really emphasizes the need for more holistic approaches and obviously the need for more robust cumulative effects research. On this slide, I included a map from the Major Projects Inventory Report. So this outlines the large-scale resource projects that are expected to come online in the next 10 years. So we know that the Government of Canada's policy agenda and environmental priorities are focusing on net zero by 2050 and clean growth. NRCan recently released the Powering Canada's Forward, building a clean, affordable, and reliable electricity system for every region of Canada in August of 2023, which outlines plans to decarbonize our electricity grids by 2035. So over the next decade, we can confidently anticipate future development of numerous renewable energy, critical minerals, and sustainable forestry projects. So with that in mind, many of these projects will overlap geographically with current and past development. So there is a need to advance research to better understand and manage cumulative effects. And this information will be valuable to support and inform the assessment process. So thinking of all of this together, sort of our funding for the research is intended to support assessments. Cumulative effects is becoming a growing issue that we have not figured out how to manage. And thirdly, that we're anticipating more projects to come online. We realized that we had to be more strategic in terms of where are we funneling our research funding for cumulative effects. And so that's really what started this initiative back in the summer of 2021. And as part of that, we formed a committee, and kind of those last 3 bullets outline sort of like the last pieces that I'm going to be talking about in terms of like the different iterations. So from coming up with like the considerations to the different iterations that we had to where we are now. So as I mentioned, NRCan is really, it's a science-based department. And so my group, I work in the office of the chief scientist, and we coordinate sort of our NRCan's advice and guidance into the assessment process. So we're kind of a group of science coordinators. But we have researchers across the department focusing on different specialties. And so in the fall of 2021, we kind of convened different researchers together to help us start to form sort of the considerations and to really guide this process. And so that's the list that we have here. As you can see, sort of the impact assessment division has the bulk of people, but it's in part because we have changed over, whereas our researchers have remained constant and continue to support. So as a committee, we started to scope the work through a series of discussions. We looked at past projects that analyzed and researched cumulative effects and considered the types of research NRCan does and our mandate, as well as considered why we are doing this research. And based on this reflection, we scoped our work and developed these considerations. So firstly, to advance our understanding of baseline conditions, trends, and possible future states of Canada's terrestrial environments and resource development areas. Secondly, to inform impact assessments and regional assessments. Thirdly, to assist Indigenous groups better understand the cumulative effects on their communities and territories. And finally, to advance NRCan's science and policy priorities. So as we start to identify areas to promote intersectoral collaborative cumulative effects research, we developed these criteria related to key science and policy considerations for our department, which included the location of natural resource development, ecosystem sensitivity, Indigenous rights, climate change, and socioeconomic factors. My colleague Brian, who actually did all of the GIS mapping, unfortunately isn't here today, so I'm going to do my best to showcase the different maps that he created through this initiative. He took kind of all of these science and policy considerations, and with input from the committee, he started to map to see what we could learn. And so this culminated in the first iteration of a series of maps which the committee weighted different criteria related to resource development activities, Indigenous communities, labor force, transportation networks, and infrastructure. And what resulted from this weighting exercise is the map on the right, and it showcases kind of like the new projects and the weightings that the committee had provided. From this map, you can see there's a lot of areas in yellow and red that are potentially suitable for cumulative effects research. From this mapping exercise, we had internal discussions as a committee as we saw a lot of different priorities, and part of those discussions start to morph into how we conduct our science and how we're structured as a department. So as I mentioned, NRCan is a science-based department. Half of the workforce is in the scientific and technical fields. So that's approximately 2,000 employees who are spread out across Canada. So a lot of our research is happening in the regions. Within our committee, we had like members from Corner Brook, Halifax, Quebec City, and Sault Ste. Marie. And each of these researchers were in different programs, and they're structured very differently too. So some of our foresters, they tend to focus on areas that they're close to, where they live and work, because it's easier to do field work. Whereas we also had remote sensing scientists who are national based in scope. And then our geoscientists tend to travel across the country to do their research projects based on the mineral resource or the project. So in addition to that, many researchers remain focused like on their areas of expertise, which is not really conducive to broader or interdisciplinary, intersectoral, regional assessment type research. So these realities made it difficult to agree on a limited selection of priority areas, and so the committee started to pivot. So we came up with the second iteration. And so with this, we are still interested on the where, but wanted to narrow it down to see if there was less areas prioritized. So we discussed as a committee and landed on these cumulative effects scenarios. So our department and our mandate is sustainable development of natural resources. So we refocused on resource development activities, and Brian took this information and he started to map it again. So you can see on the maps on the left, we start to structure it based on past, present, and future forestry, mining, and energy projects. And then we merge that information into past, present, and future to see where are the areas that intersect. And you can see that on the map on the right. And so sort of like those, the ABC color there is the areas that we're like, okay, maybe these are areas to focus on when we're considering kind of the cumulative effects scenario piece. The committee agreed that this map was an improvement as it focused like on past, present, and future resource development based on location, but it was still difficult to identify priority areas. And again, researchers have their own nuanced criteria for selecting their study areas. So the committee felt it was still a useful map to think about where to conduct their research, to use as more like a consideration. As a committee, we discussed that there are also different levels of cumulative effects research. So some focus more on like baseline data, where others focus on frameworks. And we agreed through this mapping exercise that we need to accommodate kind of like both of these types of research styles, which got us starting to look at sort of the organization and the framework of information. And so we looked at this adaptive management information ecosystem framework to kind of differentiate the different types and levels of cumulative effects research, and sort of this need for both types of like bottom-up, top-down strategy. So in this diagram, you'll see kind of at the bottom that primary scientific research, which can include like the baseline studies focused on like a specific component, where in the middle we start to see sort of that integration analysis piece, which could be like the frameworks that is utilizing sort of that baseline data. Ultimately with the objective of informing decision-making and monitoring actions. So after thinking about kind of the diverse research that NRCan does and how our science sectors are structured and how our researchers choose their study areas, we sort of refocused our objectives and plans. And we came up with these. So our current objectives is to assist cumulative effects research by providing key considerations and context related to cumulative effects, and to encourage research in areas that favor past, present, and future natural resource development. What we're hoping to do is to increase cumulative effects research in locations of potentially highest need, and also to visualize, communicate, and assess status of cumulative effects research and future research needs. Our ultimate goals are to encourage, promote sort of this interdisciplinary collaboration among NRCan's cumulative effects scientists, as well as to better respond to future regional assessment and impact assessment needs through the development and creation of science and technical advice and knowledge. So we have landed on the Cumulative Effects Research Areas Mapping tool. So this is a GIS tool that we are going to start to input researchers like study information related to cumulative effects. We're asking researchers to actually take a look at this map so that they can think about framing their project in terms of the CE scenarios. And then at the end of this, we're hoping that we'll have this repository inventory that we can then utilize to see sort of like how our research all fits together and see where potentially there is gaps in it. As part of this, we have a decision tool that we're going to be asking researchers to fill out so that they are thinking about sort of their project through that lens. And so that is sort of the step that we're at, is launching this internal pilot to promote CE research in locations of highest need, and also to encourage intersectoral and multidisciplinary collaboration when possible, and also to visualize sort of where our cumulative effects research is happening. And sort of, why did I bring it here? Well, I have these discussion questions. I know this isn't technically the right, sorry, thank you. I forgot that I was not advancing. 2 different computers, but I hope you guys did get a chance to see this map, right? Did you guys? Yeah, okay. This is like the key map, so yes. Bringing it here to this venue, we really do want our cumulative effects research to better support assessment processes. And so I would love, during the coffee chat, if you have any thoughts on sort of our approach or maybe considerations that we haven't actually thought about, to come speak to me. And as I said, we are trying to influence sort of what we're doing as a department and the cumulative effects research agenda. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. If I can call on the speakers from this session to come on back up, and we can start our Q&A session. We've got some time, about 20-25 minutes for that. All right, so just a quick recap before lunch. We had members from OAIA talk about some of the research that's taking place, and then after lunch, we had our case study in highway exemptions, a discussion on biodiversity, and then the last presentation here with NRCan and cumulative effects. So, any questions from the room on the 4 presentations around innovative approaches to impact and environmental assessment? Yep.
Oh, okay. Great. Thank you so much for all of your presentations. They were great. I was just wondering how maybe each of you have experienced your research being taken up into the impact or environmental assessment processes. What has that experience been like? And do you have any room or suggestions for improvement in specifically integrating research into the policy or into the legislation or into the framework? Thank you.
Any takers?
I can go.
Yeah.
Is this on? Okay. Yeah, so great question. I think you work in Magali's team at the agency, is that right? We met in Ottawa? Okay. Good to see you. Yeah, so certainly, like what you're getting at, I think is like knowledge mobilization, which is like a priority for Jen and I in the research program. And we can certainly point to specific examples, and I think I think Anna and Justina's work is one example. It's more in progress, but that work is something that was intended to, directly inform improvements to operational policy tools like the Tailored Impact Statement guidelines. So I think that's one example. It's in progress, and the TAC is continuing to focus on the treatment of biodiversity this year. That research was completed kind of last fiscal year. So that's one example, and there have been similar examples with previous research related to gender-based analysis plus and effects on missing murdered Indigenous women and girls that have also kind of directly been translated into the something like the Tailored Impact Statement guidelines. And but yeah, we're also working on a bit of a dissemination or knowledge mobilization strategy, because we know there's more that we can be doing there to actually get it. We've got a wealth of kind of research on the website, and we're looking to really hone in on, okay, like how do we translate that into practice a little bit more. But yeah, those are a couple of examples, if that's helpful.
Also, NRCan and ECCC have been working on this platform called the Open Science and Data Platform. And so as part of that, there is a series of different data sets and also publications that are readily available. I will say sort of like our research that has been done for the last 5 years, a lot of that is now just starting to be published. But I do think sort of the Open Science and Data Platform is a tool in which eventually I would love us to get to a point where we can zone in on where a project is. And if there is existing data sets, publications, research already done, that we could utilize this better within the assessment process.
Thank you.
Can I maybe just jump in?
Yeah, you bet.
On that. Yeah, I think your question really gets at learning, right? Like one of the things that impact assessment should be helping with is learning how we do better across assessments and into the future, and then also learning how we better integrate knowledge from the broader kind of academic and research community into assessments. And I would hope that the agency, as part of its game plan on knowledge mobilization, would be to develop like indicators of success for impact assessment that can help that learning process into the future, because like there's so much learning to be done from the broader community and knowledge holders, and then also like between assessments.
Great point. Sandy.
We have one here first.
Oh, you're right there, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, no, go for it.
It's kind of an add-on to that question, but putting it in the positive light, can you, perhaps any members of the panel, can you perhaps describe some best practices you've seen where the proponents have leveraged the best science available and best baseline information? Is there anything that you've worked through that you might want to reference as a best practice for us practitioners to take a look at? Thank you. Uh-oh. Joking.
Any takers? Yeah. We'll come back to that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's better. Wow. When you give examples of like significantly large infrastructure projects like GTA West and Bradford Bypass, like I don't really see that comment holding water, to be honest. Like if you look at GTA West, the whole needs and justification and alternatives to stage was almost well over a decade. So, you know, on smaller projects, I get it, but that's not kind of how I've seen things for very substantive infrastructure projects in Ontario.
So I think this is on. I take your point about political interference, but I want to take you back to the purpose of EA is actually to avoid that, right? And so when we start getting into politically motivated exemptions, it really is, the starting point is devaluing that EA process and the value of that process in advising decision makers about which projects to prioritize, right? Because that was supposed to be the focus or, you know, the main objective of EA. So, and, you know, when you say that maybe it's been my experience that EA is largely driven by mitigation, I mean, I've worked on EAs for 15 years on both large and small projects, and the vast majority spend less than a page on need and alternatives. And that is a real firing point for community stakeholders. They haven't forgotten what the purpose of EA is. And when they see that, that is a red flag. That is waving the red blanket in front of the bull and saying, I have no idea why I'm building this. I have no idea why I'm building this instead of something that might be less environmentally impactful writ large. I haven't done the work. So, you know, there are some projects that do some evaluation of need and alternatives, but those are usually highly constrained to different routes of a highway, different numbers of lanes, whether or not to put an HOV lane in, you know, whether or not to go through the wetland. These are not really alternatives analyses in the sense that was originally intended in EA, which is, should we build a highway at all? And that is something that is really missing from most EAs still. And it's a really important step. And it does send a signal to stakeholders when you gloss over that step. And you may have political marching orders, but I guess what I would say is, what signal are you sending to people that you can't explain why you're doing this in a transparent way?
That's great. I would add something in there as well, maybe just a generic question on it is project level EA the right spot for the alternatives analysis? Should there be more of a focus on strategic environmental assessment where we're making those need and justification decisions further up the chain and that tiered forward down to a project level? Sandy, sorry, did you want to say something else?
No, I don't want to get into a big dialogue back and forth. Maybe we should take it offline. But I guess just when you talk about alternatives, in the example that you presented on and that I commented on, the whole GTA West, like the first 8 years, it wasn't about where we're putting a highway. It wasn't about that at all. It was about how do we move people from A to B, how many people are coming. It was a broader assessment, but I don't want to get into details. I understand where you're coming from, and agree with generally what you're saying. It's just that there are larger AIs I've seen done well. Some.
I have racked my brain and may have come up with a few examples of better EAs I could point to.
Perfect, yep.
You're welcome.
Yep.
I mean, so 2 of them are before my time. So the first Mackenzie gas pipeline project, obviously, and then a related one, Voisey's Bay. And this really comes back to collaboration as a model, right? Like Voisey's Bay was heralded as being a good collaboration between the 2 Indigenous governments, the province and the feds, and that resulted in a project that everybody could approve. And then I'd also say that the wood fiber LNG, I think, is well accepted, at least by the Squamish First Nation, as a successful collaboration between the proponent and the nation. So if you're not familiar with that one, it's out in BC. And Squamish approached the province and the feds to ask for a collaborative approach, and the feds at least said no. I think the province also said no. And so they entered into a contract directly with the proponent, under which the proponent agreed to give Squamish all of the information it required and to be bound by the Squamish First Nation's decision and conditions of approval. And the Squamish First Nation, at least the folk who ran the assessment and decided on it, I think see that as a pretty successful model. And particularly, I think, because they did end up collaborating with the province, so it was a substituted assessment to the province of BC, and they were able to arrange with the province and with the proponent that the Squamish First Nation would have access to all the information and to be a part of discussions around information requests, so as to avoid duplication for the proponent, so the proponent didn't have to go through a separate Squamish assessment. So that, I think that just in terms of working directly with the nation in whose territory the project was located and agreeing to a decision-making framework, I mean, it resulted in a project approval and the consent of the nation. I know that there are non-Indigenous community concerns with it still, but probably one of the more successful models I'm aware of.
Two questions over here.
Thank you. Thanks for all your presentations. Very interesting, very good. We've heard about the transparency and the need for it in the EA process and related processes, and we've also heard about a few different mechanisms to increase that transparency, reducing political interference, the open science and data platform Christina mentioned. What more needs to be done to increase the transparency and openness of these processes to ensure or at least improve public confidence?
You go and then I'll go.
I think a recurring theme that I sense in a lot of major EAs is a fear of the public and of opposition to the project. And so, it's not uncommon to see, for example, the most controversial impacts get skimmed over in an EA, and, things that are more difficult to wrestle with, like need and alternatives, get skimmed over. I think what Anna just said about thinking about it as a more collaborative process where you're getting public feedback and you're addressing that feedback and you're dealing head on with the more challenging impacts of the project is really what proponents need to work towards to make EA successful in the sense that it is driving decision making and not just mitigation. And you know, I think it's underestimated the degree to which kind of trying to control information actually exacerbates things rather than improves them. Because it may be that the impacts of something can be managed or can be justified. But if that analysis isn't transparently there, it really does cause increased agitation. It makes it frustrating for First Nations because then they don't know how their rights are impacted, and they're not getting information that's relevant to those issues. And so I think it's really just about, at the outset of the project, trying to frame up what are the points of contention and how can we effectively address them, as opposed to being afraid of those pieces and worried about talking about them.
Yes. And then I would also add, I think one of the issues that I've been noticing, you know, I think the agency has been trying to do a better job of showing how feedback has been considered. And we heard this in the morning presentation on better Indigenous engagement and consultation. People really want to see how, like whether and how, and if not, why not, their comments were received. So like in the early days under the Impact Assessment Act, I noticed that, you know, sometimes alternatives would be proposed in an initial project description and then they wouldn't make it into the tailored impact statement guidelines and there'd be no explanation of where they went and why. So just being more transparent around why we're making the decisions that we're making around scoping and, you know, key values and how we're considering comments received. And then second, and this is kind of to Laura's point too, like I think we also, it would really, really help if frameworks for decision making and reaching basic conclusions and making recommendations were clearer. So coming back to biodiversity, we have this obligation under the Federal Act to consider the extent to which projects help or hinder. Well, I mean, what does that mean, right? So when you're looking at one project against, you know, let's stop the extinction rate of species, we need to get more granular about what that looks like for Canada and how to stack up a project against those and the extent to which is. So like being much clearer, I think, about how we're going to draw conclusions and how we may make decisions then sets everybody up kind of in a more common starting place for what information we need and what we're going to be doing with that information.
Question here, and then I think I saw a hand at the back as well too, so go here and then back here.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to add a comment and then ask a question as well. And kind of taking us back in time to the conversation that was happening around transparency. And what came to mind for me is my experience working on the Site C project in BC. And we had a project that was being sold as being needed to power the province of BC. And then it got approved, and then it got sent to the BC Utilities Commission, and it was too late to actually reverse the project at that point. So that's the risk that we run, and that was, you know, under an environmental assessment regime that wasn't assessing impact to rights until the permitting stage, and now we're flooding, you know, the Peace River. So I just wanted to put, you know, that's kind of a serious impact of not undertaking that work at the right stage. So I just wanted to add that comment. And then my question is for Christine, and the work around the cumulative effects piece. And the Indigenous clients that I work for and alongside obviously have a really fine focus on cumulative impacts on the exercise of Indigenous rights. And the Yahi case is certainly very poignant in showing development over time. And it seems that a lot of the focus and uptake we get with proponents or Crown that are dealing with some of our clients is around areas where there is some past, current, and future development. However, there are some clients that I support where there hasn't been a lot of development that really draws the attention of individuals saying, oh, there hasn't been a lot here, so there's no cumulative impacts. And I wonder if at this stage, there is your thoughts on doing some focus work in those areas where we haven't hit that threshold yet, or where we're worried about hitting that threshold, and if there might be some good lessons learned from approaching cumulative effects from that early stage. So just your thoughts on that, and yeah, I'm curious.
No, great question. I will say that was part of our considerations too, because like if you're going into an area that hasn't been developed, right, there won't necessarily be the baseline and those pieces. And so we do have researchers who are focused in areas where I would say there hasn't been past or present development. It was more sort of like as we are trying to get people to come together. So like I will say kind of like our research projects, they vary in scope. And like we have some researchers who are focused on like particular contaminants and like their fate of transport. And then we have others who are developing kind of like more of these large scale frameworks that could be used within a regional assessment for decision making. And the scope piece becomes really hard to integrate and to manage together. So I still think there is this need for like baseline data across Canada, and we have our remote sensing scientists who are working on like a national base. But as we try to figure out where to maybe target or encourage people, we decided on those CE scenarios, but it doesn't eliminate or take away from actually needing to have sort of the scientific foundations to understand what are the potential impacts and how do we think about this more holistically, integrated all together. And so, yeah, it's a wicked problem, and there's no easy like solution here, but I think our department has an interest in doing better research and more kind of focus through a framework, and so that's why the concentration that we've landed on is more towards areas where there is past, present, and future. But sorry,
Great, thanks. I think we had one at the back here. I saw a hand up previously. Yeah. I probably have time for one or two more after this.
Hello, I have a biodiversity question. So in your 3 wishes, you mentioned one of them would be working groups. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit. Like who would you like to be included in those working groups in a best case scenario? And what would their focus be if you were looking at sort of solution oriented? Are you looking at, sorry, you seem to already know, go for it.
But you can finish.
It was just going to make it more broad, so please.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've been thinking about for a while, and not just in the context of biodiversity. The MINAC made a recommendation to the minister in its first report around the use of working groups. So, I mean, I see, and they've been used before in other jurisdictions, right? BC has a long history of working groups, but it doesn't invite ANGOs to them. It tends to be just local governments, First Nations, the proponent, and the province, and maybe the feds. So on top of those key authorities, I would add independent experts, and knowledge holders. So you have, the nations, but then knowledge holders, independent experts, and environmental groups. And start early, right? Like appoint them early in early planning and keep them going all the way through. So I think one of the things, and I've done my thinking mostly at the federal level, but in the planning stage, they would do things like identify key issues, try to come to consensus at least, on what are the key issues we're going to focus on, what do we need from the proponent, are there studies that we can, delegate to not the proponent, like, health impact assessments could be done by local health authorities or Indigenous nations themselves. And then using that working group to then evaluate information, identify gaps and further studies needed and by whom. I think the thing that, like a big piece of feedback that we got in doing interviews in our research was that federal expert departments aren't being engaged meaningfully by the agency, which was a bit mind-blowing to me because I'm used to members of the public saying we're not being meaningfully engaged by the agency, but it seems that still expert federal departments are just getting like an email saying, here's a project description, please, and here's a form to fill. What are the key issues and information that we should be getting from proponents? And so there's no dialogue, right? So it's really just like I think that the process would be much more effective, and the feds now have this whole budget 2023 commitment, and they've set up a ministerial working group that will also be looking at amendments to the act, but the ministerial working group is committed to finding efficiencies in impact assessment and regulatory processes. If you want like quality and efficiency, I think working groups is your best way to get there, right? Because focusing is key to efficiency, but it's scary. Nobody wants to make the decision about what shouldn't be on the table. But if you can bring all of the relevant, experts and knowledge holders and authorities and rights holders together to say, no, okay, we think that we can, at least for now, just focus on these things. Maybe we can do a better job while not throwing spaghetti at the wall.
Thank you.
Great. And we got a question right up here.
Thank you. So I have a question, I guess mainly related to the cumulative impacts presentation. I noticed on your map that you had up there that there were some renewable energy projects noted on the map. And I'm just wondering kind of what the current thinking is now because these renewable energy projects obviously have kind of long-term energy transition benefits, which has sort of broad-scale climate benefits. But also there's the local environmental impacts of building them and the construction impacts as well. So I'm just wondering kind of like what the most recent thinking of is of how those two factors kind of play into each other and how that plays into the cumulative impacts discussion.
So I will say that we were focused sort of like on what our mandate is and sort of like what are the priorities of our department as a whole. And so this whole concept around like green growth, renewable energy is part of the dialogue that is currently happening. And so on the second iteration map, we used the information that's available in the major projects inventory. So this is like a 10-year lookout of the projects that are large scope that they're anticipating to come to fruition. And so this gets updated annually and it's discussed between like the ministers of natural resources with the provinces and my minister. And so we utilize that information, recognizing that this was kind of like our best source at guessing what are those future projects that we can anticipate to come online. It wasn't like a commentary on like green growth or those pieces. That wasn't part of the dialogue, but it was more like where can we anticipate with more certainty. I hope that makes sense.
Can I just add to that a bit? So yeah, we didn't highlight this example in our presentation because it's kind of a new initiative, but the agency is working to fund a project that I think is aligned with kind of what you're thinking, and it would look at, specifically cumulative effects of clean growth projects. So we're working with the researcher based out of Carleton University who's setting that work up, and I can't speak to it in detail today, but yeah, if you have questions, happy to connect offline, and we could take it offline too and see if there's a potential for collaboration on that work.
Great. We got time for one last question. I think I saw a hand at the back table.
Yeah.
Thanks, and it's actually not a question. I just wanted to add to some of these answers. If you're talking about how do we make trade-offs, and if you're curious on a project basis, I would say that practitioners will still look at both. So when there is a possible clean growth project, practitioners are still asking, is this a smart project? And so we'd still collect information about impacts on biodiversity and just bring all of the information forward so that decisions can be made with all of the information. So it wasn't a question, it was just adding.
No, that's great.
I think
That means we
someone
have
here-
time for one more question then. So that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Beth, you encouraged me to ask questions, so I'm asking questions. Anyway, thank you. Thank you. So my last question, and it's really related to biodiversity, and we have an offsetting compensation protocol. It's an ecosystem compensation protocol that the Toronto Region Conservation Authority applies it's based on a watershed scale. It's based on more local direct impacts and that. Are you aware of other such protocols in other parts of Canada that are being applied, or even from a project-specific basis, if there's any? Because I'm looking at it, it kind of ties into your earlier request, Jenna and Michael, about areas of research, and I'm just wondering if there is more research around that as well taking place, and if you're aware of projects or work around that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. This is going too far back in the mists of my memory because that project was like 6 months ago. Yeah, let me think about it and I'll get back to you. I mean, the one I can mention is the one that I mentioned in the presentation, that ECCC is coming up with its offsetting policy, which would include, I believe, would also apply under the Impact Assessment Act. Yeah, let me think. I know that there are some reasonable international examples. But not, yeah, I don't know of any within Canada other than the ECCC one that they're working on.
And on the research side, John, like I forget if you mentioned it this morning, Anna, but Justina led a related project focused on the mitigation hierarchy in federal regulatory management of natural resources, and that report is now posted on the agency's website as well. So I encourage you to check that one out. And I can't speak to it in a lot of detail as a non-subject matter expert, but I think that's one example that could be a good resource for you.
Thank you to our speakers in session 2.